So language is basically a flow-on effect from social and the delayed development we discussed about in the social section. So the young ASD student or person doesn't seek out the same amount of joint attention, which doesn't preclude as much communication, which therefore means that they have less developed language as compared to a neurotypical child of the same age. So typically, people with ASD have quite good receptive language, but they're not quite as good communicating the language that they are aware of. Now, one way of shortcutting this is that if the student or the person has a RRIB, they often use that to develop their language. So if they like watching Monty Python films, for example, they'll be able to quote the entire film verbatim, and that will then often give the false impression that their vocabulary is quite developed because they have very specific argot or a very specific vocabulary range around their interest. But that may not be true for the rest of their language areas. Obviously, I'm an English teacher, so without going into too much detail, the English language is extremely complicated. So basically, I'm me and you are you, but together we are we. So even just the most basic concept like that of pronouns, you can see how the rules are not entirely consistent, and it may be confusing for a person with ASD to understand that, you should ask me, but I'm I and you are you. But then when it's you talking, then you are, I, and this exchanges as we communicate. And having an innate understanding of social communication obviously makes this all seem quite clear because it's obvious to us, but to a person with ASD it's a lot more complicated and a lot less inherently understandable. In a lovely film called Life Animated, it tells the story of an author and his son with ASD. Who would repetitively watch VHS tapes of old Disney cartoons and films. And then the author used this as sort of a bridge to speak to and interact with his child. So he would present the child with puppets from the films he liked, and he'd quote lines that he felt were relevant to his child, and then they would be able to communicate using basically only quotes from the film to express, emotional states and things like that. So this is kind of an example of how language is complicated, but you can sort of unlock it using the RRIBs, or the interests of the students or the people. So in other aspects of communication that are complicated, any type of symbolic language, so similes, metaphors, personification, all the complicated aspects of language are tricky. So you sort of have two conflicting views when you're interacting with a person with ASD. Do you speak what is sometimes called ASDEs or autismese, or some ugly phrase like that, which is basically you're very literal and you're very clear and you don't ask redundant questions? Or there is sort of the camp who thinks you just speak normally and naturally, and then you expect the person with ASD to sort of pick this up. So common teacher expressions, or sort of what we think of as rhetorical questions, I guess, things like, when you say something like, would you like to speak over all of us, or pull up your socks, those sort of silly throwaway teacher lines that we use that everyone, we believe, understands. People with ASD will find that quite confusing and may actually literally pull up their socks or answer a question that you felt was clearly rhetorical. And this is one example of sort of the divide between if you speak as literally as possible, or if you believe your students should eventually pick up your expressions and learn what you mean by them. Of course, if you're going to maintain your language as normally as possible when interacting with this person, it may just mean a little bit more explaining if there's a particular phrase you use frequently, what it means, so that they can actually understand and grasp what you are trying to communicate. And just lastly, in terms of language, ASD students will be able to read typically quite well, so the role of decoding and reproducing the sounds of the words will be quite clear, but what they will lack is the more subtle things like inference, prediction, and a general comprehension of the piece that they are reading.